Welcome to the Making Space podcast. Here we are again with what has been just an exciting set of conversations. The goal of this podcast is to help you as a leader see the influence that physical spaces, be that within our church buildings or outside of church spaces, can have on the formation of our emotions, thoughts, and behavior. I'm here with pastor and author, an all-round good guy, Jay Kim. Jay, we've been having fun. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Benjamin. Yeah, we have been having a lot of fun, and my brain is just on fire from these conversations we've been having, and so excited about. I think our conversation today is going to go into a space and a direction that's really unique. So I'm super excited about it.
Absolutely. And I mean, both of us are pastors. We're big believers in the local church. And I think getting different perspectives on the role that buildings and physical places play in every arena of life has been, super helpful. Buildings are not just functional or practical. There is some expression of our values and culture in the buildings that surround us and that we embody.
Yeah, and I think we're also learning that they're formational, in ways that we don't even really think about, but they're formational at a baseline level. And that's been one of the most fascinating things I've been learning. And I think we're going to delve into some of those ideas in some unique ways today. And, we've been telling folks who've been listening, and first of all, thank you all for listening and for joining us on this journey. But I'd be remiss if I didn't remind you, this podcast is just one part of a larger project between the Barna Group and our friends at Aspen. We've been letting you know that, our theme for this season has been making space for welcome. And there's obviously all sorts of other resources that we'll tell you about as a part of this larger project. But we've been reminding you that if you go to barna.com/making space, the journal 1, Making Space for Inspiration, is available to you there. So I'd encourage you to check that out. If you're a Barna Access Plus subscriber, of course, you get immediate access. You probably already have it. And I'm sure like as it has for me as a church leader and just as a follower of Jesus, some of this information and data has been so helpful. And I think our conversation today, Benjamin, is going to be helpful along those lines as well.
Folks, we're in for a treat today. We have special guest Jonathan Schaffer with us. And by means of introduction, it's some bio. He blends 10 years of experience across architecture, retail, and brand design. Jonathan is a multidisciplinary designer who brings brands to life, both physically and digitally. Currently, Jonathan is a designer at Meta, working in their Reality Labs division, where he is focused on creating experiences built around their augmented and virtual reality products. Prior to Meta, Jonathan spent 7 years designing retail concepts and flagship stores for Nike across the world, actually where he and I met. Before relocating to the East Coast, Jonathan served at Manor House Church in Portland, Oregon, where he led the First Impressions team at their downtown campus, in addition to acting as a creative consultant for branding and spatial design. Jonathan, his wife, Michelle, 3 children, now reside in New Jersey. Jonathan, that's a great introduction. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks, man. Appreciate it. It's great to be here.
Yeah, we so appreciate you taking the time, and you come from a fascinating set of, experiences and background. So I'm keen to jump in and hear some of your thoughts on this. You have a lot of local church context. I mean, so I think that really helps this conversation. But one of the reasons I've been looking forward to talking with you is that you've been involved in developing spaces well outside of the church in different kinds of environments. And ultimately, I mean, people are people. A lot of this translates. Barna found that 4 in 5 US adults, 83%, agree that church buildings should reflect the beauty of God. Now, in your line of work, in the context you're in, What are the larger questions you're asking when you're thinking about how to design any physical space?
Great question. And I appreciate the insight too that this data is providing. The fact that, so many respondents think that church buildings should reflect the beauty of God is really telling. So I think to answer your question, some of the questions I would ask myself when designing a space or approaching a project is, what is the purpose of this space? Why does it exist? What is the function of it? Is it meant to delight and inspire? Is it purely functional? Does this space need to fit into a larger narrative? What is the larger story that this is trying to tell? How do we want to make people feel once they come into this space? What are some of the emotions that we want to evoke? I think those are some of the questions that I really try to ask myself when I'm approaching any type of work, really.
So, I mean, when it comes to what people today are looking to feel and experience within spaces they're in, what are some of the things that come to mind for you in today's culture?
Yeah, I think from at least some of the research that I've been doing on the secular side of things in the retail design space, what we've been finding is that people, especially in cities, because these stores that I've worked on, these retail and experiential activations are predominantly in really urban areas. And we're finding that people are, even though they're surrounded by others, they still feel lonely. They have this sense of being alone. And in spite of that, we really see this as an opportunity to design spaces for community, for bringing people together, for sharing like-minded ideas, goals, aspirations, and creating this more of a communal space of coming together and connecting with their favorite brands. So that's kind of what we're seeing a little bit in the culture, at least, especially in urban areas.
So it's pretty cool, Jonathan. I mean, you've been involved in designing, retail spaces, like you're describing in urban areas, now involved in augmented reality, virtual reality. I mean, you're in that industry just as a means of I'm sure there's a lot you could say, but a brief touch point. What should pastors be thinking about in this space? I mean, for many of us, it's like, oh my goodness, another thing to think about with technology.
Right.
Do we need to be wearing goggles? How significant will this be? Can I ignore it as a pastor?
Yeah. Oh, great question. I don't to be blunt and answer it. I don't think it can be ignored. However, I would say that leaders should not feel pressure to jump into it prematurely, that they should allow themselves time to understand it, to fully wrap their heads around this new augmented reality and virtual reality space that we're launching into. Think of it as the next wave of the internet or social media before that this is a new thing that is going to be there. It'll be there for a while. And I really would encourage pastors to think about, hey, how do we tap into this from like a content distribution standpoint? Like, what are some augmented reality filters we should be thinking about with creatives that we're putting out there on our social media? Is there anything that's relevant for us and part of our story before jumping into it prematurely just because it's the new thing, right? So, really look into it, understand it, and think about how it fits into your narrative of your church.
Mm. Jonathan, one of the things that's so interesting and fascinating to me just about your story and the fact that we're having this conversation with you is that, yes, you are deeply embedded now in what some would call the secular space.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most people, what they mean is you don't work at a church or something.
Yeah.
But you worked at a church for a long time, and you created space in churches before you began creating space in these really dynamic ways. And so I think it gives you a really interesting perspective. And I heard something from you as you were describing the questions you ask about when people enter a space. And what struck me is humans are humans, Christian or not,
Mm-hmm.
human beings are human beings. And as followers of Jesus, for all of us, what we believe is that humans are the way they are because they are made in the image of a very particular God, and we have these longings for connection, like you said, in a very isolated world and so many other things. Along those lines, in this study, one of the things that Barna found was that we asked U.S. adults to choose between a series of terms when it came to describing their ideal church or their ideal church space or experience. And 3 and 4, 75% said they would prefer calming experiences over exhilarating
Hmm.
spaces. 4 and 5, almost 80% said they would actually prefer familiar spaces over spaces of novelty. Um, and then about 3 and 5, this was really surprising to me. About 3 and 5, 62% chose that they would prefer classic spaces over modern spaces. So those were questions and tendencies and preferences specific to the church. I'm curious, in your work in non-church spaces, what sorts of trends, design trends, are you seeing? Is some of that data stuff you're seeing in the secular world as well, or is it different out there?
Yeah, great question, Jay. And I kind of want to double click into the delineation between maybe the classic and modern, and maybe, what Barna found in terms of the terminology that was used. Because that's a little surprising to me. I wonder, like, did they interpret modern as being like this austere kind of, soulless concrete, space, or
Right.
what, what was that like? Maybe you could shed some light on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the language was the language, maybe intentionally to leave some of that room. And maybe what's helpful is it was a question specific to church spaces. So then I think people have a paradigm. They think about, maybe, I think it might be a bit of what you're saying. A modern space, they might think of what most of us think of when we think of a modern evangelical building, which is primarily very high on functionality.
Hmm.
Maybe it's sort of like a gutted Costco or
Totally.
something,
Totally. Yeah.
versus classic. And a word we've heard a lot from our guests on this podcast is transcendence,
Hmm.
the sort of intricacy of design, the intentionality of beauty. It's something you spoke to earlier about, inspiration, those sorts of things. So my guess is that it would be something along those lines.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for the added color there. I think what I'm at least seeing in some of the secular space and kind of the retail, or some of the trends that we're identifying. And again, that these are just trends, it's not necessarily set in stone, but, I think especially coming out of COVID, we really challenged ourselves to have a reason for retail. Like, why would somebody come into a store and shop? Like, versus just going online, going on their phone and buying whatever they want and have it shipped to their home. And so I think it's actually put some more pressure testing on us as sort of retailers and spatial designers, to think about, okay, we can't just do these big box retail stores that were stacked full of shoes and apparel and whatever else you would want, and having more meaning and purpose behind that. So going from being transactional to becoming more relational. I think, and this isn't just based off of my current work, but thinking about spaces that are viral, that are Instagrammable in nature, that you want to post and share about, and almost like designing for that capture, for that perfect frame as you would walk into a space. Whether you're within that frame, it's like a selfie in a mirror, or it's just an inspirational canvas that you see inside of a space, or something that just really surprises and delights. I would say probably within the retail design space, we would skew more towards the novelty, thinking about how competitive the landscape is. And this is kind of where it would be different, but, thinking about how a customer might be deciding to walk into one brand store versus another brand store, and how we might use certain design cues or things to offset against one another, knowing what our competitors are doing. So that it's a bit of a different landscape, but I think there's maybe some cues there. In terms of some of the behaviors that we're seeing, shifting into something that isn't so literal, or something that it could be identified as a trope. Like, I don't know, just from my experience, I wouldn't say, hey, for your children's ministry, go put a big arc in it, right? Like, I don't know if that's really the space that we're coming from, or going to. Thinking back on my experience at Nike, like, we transitioned from a creative direction around what we called Field House at the time. And it was literally the embodiment of your old school gymnasium. Like, it was like literally bleacher boards on walls. It would feel like a high school locker room almost. And that was in probably the early 2010s. And then we transitioned quickly, because we started to see, well, that's actually too literal. It's too on the nose. And for some people, it's actually not approachable enough. And so we shifted into more of this modern sport ethos of a creative direction that was more about your modern yoga studio celebrating health and wellness. And I think it's kind of indicative of a shift to spaces that aren't so on the nose. Back to my earlier comment about like putting an arc in your children's ministry. Like, I think people are really wanting to see themselves in experiences that are more relevant to them, and not just some kind of cookie cutter, copy paste that could be anywhere. Like if I'm walking into a church in New York, it should feel relevant to New York. If I'm walking into a church in Austin or LA or wherever it would be, making it feel like it's a part of that city, that it's connected and tied into that region. Yeah, I mean, I could keep on going here. I think there's additionally some really interesting trends. Thinking about how our customers are becoming increasingly environmentally conscious, thinking about sustainability, circularity, in terms of materials that we're using in these environments. Our customers want to see that we're thinking about that and that we're being really genuine in terms of our approach, not just in terms of the products that we're selling, but the environment that we're presenting them in. So thinking about using, recycled rubbers and making it really evident that that's something that we're using, or you're able to see like the striations of like a pedestal that is full of like old shoes or something like that. Like there's a lot of this kind of coming up in environments, and it's really resonating with customers in terms of being like really intentional about how we're taking care of the earth, really. So yeah, those are just a couple of things. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really great. I want to follow up on that because I think one of the things that's so fascinating that I'm hearing you say, and I want to make sure I'm not reading into it. So, I feel like a big part of what you're saying is you're talking very little about the product, and it's a lot more about the customer or the client, or in the case of a church, the congregant, finding themselves not primarily where is the product? Is it literal? I see it, I take it off the shelf, but it's a much more narrative approach. Is that an accurate way to say it? I want to find myself in a particular story that the environment is sort of writing, and then, oh, I can see myself in that story. I think there might be some overlap there to the church world and spaces in the church. Is that accurate? And if it is, talk a bit about that.
Yeah, 100% accurate, Jay. Like I would say that from a retail point of view, our physical environments are a manifestation of our brand. They're an extension of not only the product that we're trying to sell, but the sort of service and other offerings, the community aspect, the kind of inclusiveness and belonging that we're trying to drive. And then I would think for like the church and pastors and administrators, definitely thinking about your space as an extension of who you are as a church, as your identity. It's not just like um, this shell that you occupy. Like it can be really a canvas for you to tell your story about where you're coming from and where you're going to. And it's definitely part of that narrative arc that you mentioned, Jay. 100%.
Yeah.
Oh, very cool. Well, I love the Nike stores in Portland, and I know you've had a hand in all of that. I think a lot of pastors, Jonathan, will see buildings like that, or large corporate buildings, and think, I just simply don't have the budget to do that in my church. So what advice would you have to pastors on a budget who maybe want to make some updates to their buildings, or even simple changes that maybe they could make for free?
Yeah. Yeah. Great question, Ben. And I think this is where it gets like real, right? Like it's like, I'm coming from a world of working with these brands that it's like they do have a lot of money. They've got budget. This is something they allocate to. And I would say for those pastors and for those leaders, and it's actually rooted in what Jay and I were just talking about too, is having that really strong sense of identity of who you are as a church, and then really using your space to reinforce that and extend your brand to tell the story of your church. Making sure that like, as time and needs change, that like your congregation grows or contracts, like making sure that your space can kind of grow and contract with that. That if you were ever to change buildings, that you could pick up and move and you wouldn't lose the sense of your identity, that you could have almost this, we use like fixtures and graphics and posters a lot, but thinking about like how that could move into another space and it could still feel like, oh, this is just the same church, but it moved buildings. So I think that's like maybe kind of a light touch way that you could approach it. Like thinking about like environmental graphics. Like I think there's such a great place for environmental graphic design, basically graphic design at an architectural or building scale for churches to really blow out like who they are as a brand and identity. And it doesn't have to be this massive reinvestment. Like you don't even have to tear down walls. Like it can just be a coat of paint and thinking about like, just light touch interventions that don't break the budget. Now, of course, like if you do have budget or you're in part of a capital campaign and you're raising funds, like, I mean, I would really prioritize things like lighting, like thinking about indirect lighting, sort of more mood lighting. I'm not talking about like stage or presence lighting, but thinking about those common areas, those places where people congregate and gather, like, the overhead fluorescence, not your friend here, right? Like thinking about the ways that you can really kind of delineate space through lighting without having to build new walls and knock old ones down. I mean, even things like seating, like I mentioned earlier, like fixtures and furniture, those things that you could take with you if you ever had to move buildings or kind of change and scale down and adapt. Wayfinding and signage, huge. Again, that ties into that environmental graphics bucket that I mentioned earlier. So those are some things that, can be a little bit on the lighter touch side, not as much capital investment.
I hate fluorescent lighting.
Yeah.
With a passion. So say Jay walks into my church and Jay's just feeling super generous and he's like, here's $100,000 to do something with the building, do an upgrade.
Easy,
right? Easy,
Benjamin.
Jay would do that without even thinking. It's that easy. What's the best way to spend that, Jonathan? $100,000. I wanna refresh my space or my foyer as a pastor. What would be some of your first things that you'd look at and go, allocate some money to this?
Yeah. I would definitely think about the foyer. I mean, you kind of let in with it, but I think it's kind of a natural space to really focus on like where that first impression is made and, thinking about like how people are coming in and redirecting them to where they need to go. Like wayfinding and signage are so important. I can't emphasize that enough. Like, and having it tie into like, again, that part of a broader identity that like, if somebody looks at your website and then they show up in your space, that it feels like it's one and the same, that there's this red thread that's continuous from like, website, mobile, social, your space, that it's like continuous throughout. So I would definitely allocate money into making sure that that's all kind of up to par. Back on my previous note on lighting, 100% would dial that up. And then definitely thinking about, allocating some spend to furniture and just having a place for people to pause and rest and sit down, that it doesn't feel so as like transactional. Like you're just like the foyers and the lobbies shouldn't just be for coming and going. They should be for a moment of pause and rest and connecting with people and building that sense of community and like making sure that people like don't slip by either, like I think, I would definitely put a lot of investment there. And then obviously thinking about like clarity around like children's check-in and just making sure that it's really easy for like parents and children not only like see where they need to go, but also making it feel like a more secure space. I know that that's like also really top of mind for myself being a parent, obviously, but for other people out there, like that's huge. So yeah, those are a couple things, if you were like dropping some dough there.
I got you, Benjamin. I got you. Yeah, that's super helpful, really practically helpful, Jonathan. We want to sort of land the plane here. So I'll ask you one final sort of specific, maybe generational question. A lot of church leaders, and I think a lot of businesses and brands as well, they're asking the question about emerging generations, younger generations. How do we tap into generations that are early on and we're sort of learning their trends and their preferences? In the Barna research, we found that, as people get, as the numbers get younger, so younger generations seem to be far more amenable to church gathering in spaces that are not necessarily designated in the sort of traditional church way. So church in a coffee shop, church in someone's home or in a park. or an art gallery, whatever it might be. So those are some trends. There are several others. I'd be curious in your work previously with Nike and your current work and other work you've done, when it comes to generationally, younger generations, are there some trends that you're seeing? Are there specific sort of design patterns or design approaches or ethics that seem to be more effective at drawing younger generations?
Yeah. Yeah. I would say that there's this desire to build almost this kind of contrast between high and low, like thinking high fashion, low fashion, high tech and low tech, um, in terms of materials, in terms of color. If you walk into like a really sterile white space, it just seems like those are becoming less and less appealing, that like people are looking for places that have like the draw and the tension to them. So I think that's a really interesting space to explore in terms of a trend that's more like up and coming. And that doesn't have to be something really, it's like, you're blacking out your ceiling and then you're creating like focal moments with like entries and doors and places that you want people to rest their eyes on. Another thing that's really interesting is transparency, and transparency in terms of both like literally and then figuratively. Like literally, people want to see like what's going on beyond the glass, beyond the storefront. And I would imagine that could possibly extend to churches, into these types of spaces that your listeners are working within. And we've seen this kind of pivot away from the really old school, Abercrombie and Fitch storefronts that were completely blocked off, now to like being able to see what's happening inside, bringing that activity forward, making it feel much more lively and populated. And then, more figuratively or metaphorically, thinking about like how we're showing, in terms of like the products that we're selling in some of these stores, like showing the process behind the design, like transparency into how these things are made, and kind of the method of make, if you will. So I think that's kind of like some underlying threads of like mixing high and low, pushing the contrast, and driving through that transparency. And maybe one other thing I'll touch on too is thinking about even pushing that more novel idea. Like if you're finding in research that people are more comfortable meeting in spaces that aren't like traditionally churches, right? Coffee shops, you mentioned homes and maybe a park. I would say to like continue to push that further, that like it's going to continue to get noisier and noisier in society, and as a large. So how are you vying for people's attention with your space and your overall experience as people are coming into your church? Like how are you creating and designing an experience that cuts through the noise and really focuses people attention on the message that you have and what you're trying to convey? So I don't know, just some thoughts there. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great, Jonathan. A final word maybe for church leaders who are listening to this. Obviously, you've given us a ton of food for thought. I love that concept of, the high contrast. Makes me think of like Mark Rothko paintings
Totally.
or something, which on the surface are so simple, but they grab you because of the contrast and then the transparency. I love the restaurants where it's the glass and you can see the chefs making the food, and you sit at the little diner stands, and there's just something so alive in that. Yeah. And as church leaders, we can think about what can we do to push in those directions. You've said so much, but I just want to ask you, as we close, maybe, if there's one big final word of encouragement or inspiration or challenge for church leaders as they're thinking about these new ideas in their church spaces, what would you say?
Yeah, I would just leave them with this thought that your space is a great asset. Like it is an incredible canvas for you to tell your story on, that you don't have to do this massive investment. You don't have to knock down walls and do massive, remodels or new builds, that there's a lot that you can do with what you already have, and think of it as a place to physically manifest who you are. Again, going back to that red thread comment earlier that I had, that like thinking about somebody's journey from like online to offline, from from digital into physical, that they should feel like it's all kind of saying the same thing. And so, really simple touches of paint, graphics, wayfinding, signage, like focusing on those things can really, really go a long way.
Yeah. So good. Jonathan, thank you so much for spending time with us. Super insightful. Loved having you on.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jay and Ben. It's been a pleasure.
Benjamin, there was so much good stuff there, man. What are you thinking? What are you processing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the intentionality there is just helpful for us, pastors, church leaders to give a lot of consideration to. And I think just the broader context, Jay, of Jonathan's career alone is fascinating, right?
Yeah.
Somebody that's, designed flagship retail stores and now involved in the augmented reality and virtual reality space. I mean, that alone should just be pause for consideration for us to go, well, times are changing and there is a bleeding of this, from physical retail design to what virtual spaces will be. I mean, that's a whole kind of conversation we didn't dive into, but, you just kind of go, well, it's interesting. There's a lot to consider there.
Yeah. I love what he said about, as church leaders, can we stop thinking about our church spaces as shells, like just these coverings over the stuff we're doing inside, and begin thinking about them as a canvas, and that's kind of a theme that's come up a couple of times in our conversations on this podcast. Can we think about the space in an artful, artistic way that sort of leads to transcendence? A lot of what Jonathan was saying, leads to telling a story, the story of, for Nike, for example, or other companies, telling the story of their brand. And for churches, telling the story of God as it has manifested and played out in the life of that local church community. I just think that's a dramatic shift in the way many of us as church leaders think about. And I loved your question, Benjamin. It's not necessarily that you need $8 million to make that happen. You can do that creatively, even with the artists in your community or the creatives in your community. I love so much of what he said.
Yeah, some really helpful tips there to do things at the church facilities on a budget, and hey, every pastor is on a budget. And so some of those thoughts were just really helpful, really practical for pastors to be able to implement. So thank you, Jay. And just a reminder to all of our listeners, if you're curious and you want to learn more about the topics that we discussed today, make sure you check out the Making Space Journal series. Journal 1, which is called Making Space for Inspiration, is live now. So you can order it today, or you can go to barna.com/makingspace, subscribe to Barna Access Plus, and you'll get immediate access to this journal and future ones that they release. So I thank you so much to our listening leaders. We're a new podcast. So if you've been encouraged or you've learned something new today and you've enjoyed our conversation, we'd love you to leave a rating or review or share this with a friend. We'll catch you next time on the Making Space podcast.